Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Melissa Chan.
And I'm Biresh Banerjee.
U.S. President Donald Trump wants what he calls a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. But is it a raw deal? And he had said he wanted it by the American holiday Thanksgiving. That's this Thursday, tomorrow, from where we're sitting here in Berlin. That, of course, is now looking very unlikely. We'll be taking a closer look at this 28-point proposal, which critics immediately observed sounded a lot like mostly what Moscow wants. The Europeans have sent a counter-proposal, and talks are ongoing to seek a resolution to this war. At least some of those original points have been changed based on Ukrainian feedback, and now there are drafts of a 24-point proposal, a 19-point proposal floating around, so it's pretty messy. Here's what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had to say about the process.
We firmly believe security decisions about Ukraine must include Ukraine, because when something is decided behind the back of the country or its people, there is always a high risk that it simply will not work. We are ready to move forward together with the United States of America, with personal engagement of President Trump, and I'm ready to meet with President Trump. And there are sensitive points to discuss. We have them still, but we must also not lose sight of reality. Russia's war against us is not in the past. It's happening every single day. Every day Russia takes Ukrainian lives.
Joining us in the studio is Tyson, Senior Associate Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and also you were formerly the Deputy Special Representative for Ukraine's economic recovery during the Biden administration. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. And then we will also have DW's Ukraine correspondent Nick Connolly joining us momentarily, remotely, of course.
And Cherie Chan is back at the Blue Table to talk to you guys and in the chat and bring in your questions and comments and to get that discussion that we'll be having on the basis of those questions and comments that you'll be bringing in. You have a poll.
Yes, I do. The weekly poll that I will bring to you. So this week we are asking, where are the latest Ukraine talks headed? There are 4 options. The first one is to a durable peace. Second, frozen battle lines. Third, Russian hostility against Europe. Or the fourth one, Trump winning Nobel Prize. Let us know what you think, and then I will let you know the result later.
We'll have that towards the end of that stream. And while you consider your responses, here's a few responses that we had to our community post that went up 24 hours in advance. So this is just a small sample of the kind of thinking that exists amongst you guys. It's, again, as I say, it's a sample. It doesn't cover every point. So let's start with user Cal Campbell, who is saying, and I quote, "Russia is in a bad situation and things are only getting worse. They need this deal more than Ukraine." A deal that Russia wants. Then you have this username, which I love. It's called Seaman Loves Pancakes. Good on you for having that username. This person saying, "Putin will never accept a peace deal that benefits Ukraine. This is all a waste of time. Russia will continue to grind down Ukraine until full capitulation." Another point of view. And then you have another party to this war, to this conflict, if you like. This is from user Nikki Katerina, who is talking about the Europeans, who asks, will Europe let the US pressure Ukraine into a raw deal? And just one more comment, if I can bring this in. It's slightly cynical, but I think it's important to sort of bring it in. This is from user Elementally YT1517, who says, and I quote, "The peace deal, Ukraine will be divided, 50% for Putin and 50% for Trump." So a sample of the comments that you have.
I wonder if this user is referencing this investment deal that we'll maybe talk a little bit about in a bit, Tyson. All right, so if you're just joining us, a reminder that we're talking about whether this plan is realistic or it's a raw deal for Ukraine, what's negotiable and what isn't. Let's dive right into this with, I'd love your just thoughts, Tyson, of the last 24 hours, 12 hours. Things seem to be changing so much ever since the leak of this 28-point proposal.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, let's just say that this is not a framework deal. It's a framework for capitulation for Ukraine, and the Ukrainians and the Europeans were not included in this process and were caught by surprise. In fact, It seems that Marco Rubio, to some extent, and certainly Keith Kellogg, the special envoy for Ukraine, Trump's personal envoy for Ukraine, were also caught by surprise by this deal. This is non-starter for the Ukrainians. This is non-starter for the Europeans. But, you know, we've learned a couple of lessons from this past year of Trump diplomacy on the Ukraine-Russia issue, and it is be grateful. That's what the Ukrainians need to do, and engage with whatever's on the table, even if it is it's a non-starter. And they have been engaging constructively in Geneva, trying to say these are the things that we can't accept. We can't accept these deep limitations on troop levels. We can't accept this basis for reconstruction, including, you know, giving all this money to the Russians, the frozen Russian sovereign assets. We can't accept the terms right now in territorial the position. We can't accept, you know, the way that things are framed with regard to NATO, and the guarantees need to be clarified that Ukraine would have. And what we're hearing from both the Ukrainians and the Europeans, which I think were the most credible actors in when we're listening to the diplomacy coming out of Geneva, is that there is some convergence being made. President Zelensky has said he would like to travel to Washington to meet with President Trump, maybe on Thanksgiving. And to I guess on the good side, what we've seen is we know that this deal, the forensics have come out. The leads on this deal in Washington have been Witkoff, the president's real estate buddy from New York, who has a kind of amorphous role as a kind of
real estate
fixer.
buddy who doesn't have that much experience with Russia and Ukraine, presumably?
Correct, but he has experience in making real estate deals, and of course that appeals to the president, and definitely has the president's trust. They have a relationship going back 30 years, and for that reason, he has been kind of empowered to negotiate on behalf of the president. He started that with Russia in getting some detained Americans released in February. Then he had this Gaza deal, which was seen as giving a sense of euphoria in Washington for, you know, making things happen. That deal is also, I think there's a lot to be examined in the strength and the goodness of that deal. And he has that same, you know, right of negotiation in the case with Russia directly, which is basically who he's been negotiating with exclusively.
Well, I mean, you talk about this being a non-starter for Ukraine and Europe, but I think I want to go to Nick Connolly now just to see where things stand in Ukraine, because it's a non-starter, but it also really depends on the negotiating leverage that Ukraine and Europe has. So let's bring in Nick Connolly of DW, Ukraine correspondent, joining us. Thank you so much, Nick. You know, people have been negotiating, the suits have been negotiating. Can you give us a quick update on where things stand in terms of what's happening on the front lines?
Well, on the front lines, we see Russia pushing ahead very slowly, but consistently as it has for the last months, basically more than a year. Pokrovsk is still in Ukrainian hands. Partially, it hasn't fully fallen yet. I think the Russians are trying to put as much as they can at those front lines to create this kind of sense of inevitability and to impress Trump that basically there is no other option but them winning and that anything else is a matter of concession to the Ukrainians and the Europeans. We've seen big attacks on Kyiv, you know, just yesterday, as has been the case for the last year or two. Every kind of 10 days, a big missile attack once they've built up those stocks to try and overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses, drones first, then ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. Ukraine obviously able to shoot a lot of that down, but not everything is intercepted. So civilian casualties and problems for Ukraine's energy and heating supply as we go into winter. So it is a difficult situation for Ukraine, but it is not like Ukraine is collapsing right now. There is no some kind of overall collapse at the front lines. You know, Kyiv is still functioning, even though it is tough. People are getting more experience at using their generators and planning their work and life around the hours when the power is there. And there is just a situation now that, again, a feeling here in Kyiv that the Trump team was just basically trying to take advantage of the bad, you know, publicity for Zelensky around the corruption scandal last week and that kind of moment of weakness to try and just force them to sign on the dotted line and get some kind of capitulation. But that is not something that anyone here feels they need to do right now. Things aren't that bad yet.
We're going to dive into the domestic issue in Ukraine with the corruption scandal in just a moment. But Nick, something you said, I asked you about the front lines, but you quickly moved into talking about how Kyiv has been impacted. And that is certainly not the front lines. Russia has been stepping up attacks in densely populated residential areas across the country. And so my question is, how is that impacting ordinary people? You've hinted at the fact that they have, they're adapting, understanding that they need to rely on generators and things like that. But what is the psychological state of Ukrainian citizens as they're watching these negotiations take place?
Obviously, it is very tough in terms of, just kind of living a normal life, trying to get your children to school and do a job if you're having to plan around power that maybe goes off at 6 a.m. That is, clear. We've had these attacks on the energy system before in previous years, but they are more intense this year and they are having more of an impact. It's noticeable here in Kyiv, whereas people maybe bought their generators in the first winter of the war and then put them aside, put them in a cellar because they didn't really need them the following winter so much. Now it is really, the case that when you walk down the street at night in Kyiv, you're often hearing the kind of rumbling of those generators on. But in terms of how that impacts their kind of, perception and the kind of pressure on Zelensky to basically make this go away, I think lots of people here in Ukraine would be very happy if this war were to end, just freeze maybe the front lines as they are right now and try and get as close to the West as possible. But the problem with this deal as presented by Witkoff and others is that most people here in Ukraine are convinced that it basically just opens the way to more Russian attacks. That if, for instance, Ukraine has to withdraw from the bits of the east of the country that it still controls, that there's going to basically be an open conflict inside the country between the military and people, who've risked their lives for years to defend that territory, asking, why have you given that away? Why have you stabbed us in the back? And that basically that kind of instability could then basically create a kind of collapse here in Ukraine that would allow the Russians to come in again and take more territory. So until they're presented with something that looks like something that could even hold in the medium term, let alone the long term, I think most people aren't going to push their leaders into signing away.
Just a few comments coming from people in the chat, if I can just bring this in. And I wanted to come back to you after that, Nick, to ask you something a bit more about how Ukrainians are dealing with the negotiations happening currently. But just talking about some of our users, here is Eddie Manfred, who's talking about Donald Trump and his involvement here. He's saying, the more Trump meddles in this affair, the more brazen and atrocious is Putin's behavior. That comment there from this user. Then you also have a comment from user Lightning51, who says Ukraine wants all of its territory back, including Crimea, and Trump knows that. We absolutely can't give Russia what they want. Nilay Chaturvedi remarking that Ukraine is caught in a dilemma. If the deal is accepted verbatim sans changes, then that could mean permanent loss of territory. And Psyche Machan talking about, I wonder if Ukrainians would agree on whatever peace deal between these two leaders, assuming she's meaning Trump and Vladimir Putin. But just on the question of the U.S. involvement here, Nick, is there a feeling that Ukrainians get that maybe they are being talked down to, that what they have been putting up for the past nearly 4 years isn't being considered, and there might be an element of condescension there from the Trump administration in the way Ukraine is being dictated terms, literally?
And I want to piggyback on that, Nick, and just share a tweet from Lucian Kim, who is was the former NPR Moscow correspondent, now with International Crisis Group. I don't know if we can pull that up, but he also echoed this sentiment, Biresh, saying that Trump associates Zelensky with his first impeachment and views Ukraine as a secondary power. Even if Trump has come to admire Ukrainians' incredible pluck, he still regards Russia as the greater power. So over to you, Nick.
Well, a lot to unpack there, but I think the overall thing is, and it's not even, behind closed doors. We've heard time and time again Trump tell the Ukrainians that they don't have any cards, and basically fawning over Putin and the greatness of kind of Russia's ability to, provide a kind of power play and the kind of the size of the country, its nuclear missiles, all that kind of stuff. That is obviously a kind of an aesthetic that appeals to Trump in a way that a kind of democratically elected leader like Ukraine's president it doesn't cut the mustard, doesn't impress him. And obviously there's the baggage there with the first impeachment, although we saw Zelensky going to great lengths trying to kind of cover that over and kind of trying to rebuild bridges with Trump and his team. We don't know how much that has contributed to his current position. I think the bigger question, just kind of taking a step back in all those user comments there, is about territory, right? About getting back Crimea or parts of the country that were occupied back in 2014. I think Ukraine is not going to sign those away and say now we recognize them as being Russian, but it's also not going to do anything to, by force, get that land back. That was already the de facto situation before 2022. No recognition, but also no active military steps. Realistically, Ukraine is not going to attack Russia to take that back. That is something that is postponed for the future in the hope that maybe at some point, like with East and West Germany, there is some kind of reunification in the future if things change in Russia, for instance. But I think Ukraine is not able to give away territory it still controls. That is just politically going to be poisonous. It would need a change in the constitution, maybe a referendum. The same thing goes for the ambition to join NATO. That's been put into the Ukrainian constitution. That is not something Zelensky can sign away without asking the rest of the country. But I think the most realistic thing from a Ukrainian perspective is just freezing things as they are now and hoping that some kind of security architecture comes that allows Ukraine to rebuild in some kind of safety.
Tyson, you've been listening. I don't know if you have any comments to any of what's been said. And I guess the question for you is, going back, is who holds the cards? Certainly, it doesn't sound like Ukraine does. Is it really just the United States?
I think it's really mixed. I think that there is a case to be said that the time is not on Ukraine's side and time's not on Russia's side. This is a moment in winter, as we just heard, the intense vulnerability of Ukraine to attacks on its energy architecture, its energy infrastructure. There have been massive attacks on nuclear substations this winter that have been very targeted and very effective. They are meant to freeze the country. Zelensky himself said that Putin has only two allies, fear and winter, and he is trying to elicit an outflow of migration again. And ultimately, there are multiple fronts to this war. There's the classical front line, the trenches that we see, the line of contact that's quite under discussion, particularly around Pokrovsk. And it's worth mentioning that even though the Russians have been making sustained grinding progress along that front line in Donbass, that they were supposed to actually overtake Pokrovsk in spring, and they still have not taken the city. So their advances have been much slower than they were anticipating. But there's also the attacks on Ukraine's economy. And that's trying to starve it of its people, that's trying to scare away investment, that's trying to make sure that the country cannot thrive. And any kind of peace deal is going to have to give the country prospects to thrive again in the geopolitical direction that it's trying to create. And that means real security guarantees. That could mean, French, German, American, British troops based in Ukraine. That could mean the provision of equipment. That needs to be something that Ukrainians feel comfortable with. And that is not in the current draft of this, 27-point plan.
Well, I mean, yes, but is there a situation where the United States can just force the Ukrainians to accept these? I know that some of these issues, as Nick pointed out, is actually not within the power of President Zelensky to agree to. But you also have an administration that likes to push things through in D.C., no matter what, and in disregard, frankly, of the rule of law, much less the rule of law in the United States as it is in terms of what the Ukrainian law says. Is there a possibility that Trump just says, you do this or we'll walk away?
It's entirely possible. What we've seen with President Trump is that he likes to kind of keep the situation dynamic. We saw, not to this degree, but a similar situation in the run-up to the Alaska summit. There was a lot of kind of chatter about a pro-Russian framework coming out prior to the meeting that happened in Anchorage between Putin and Trump. Same thing in the spring when the United States cut off ISR capabilities to Ukraine at some point. There are things that they can cut off, but the Ukrainians have been trying to learn and hedge and build resilience into their own system. If you talk to the Ukrainians now, they say, we do need Patriot missiles. We need the air cover that the United States can provide. But in every other area, they've been trying to create European and Ukrainian alternatives to make sure that their defense is not solely reliant on the United States, because they don't want to be overly reliant on a capricious partner like the U.S.
Can I just ask you a quick question before you
Yes.
move on to something else? I mean, I found something that you said a little while back very interesting. You said time is not on Russia's side. Why is time not in Russia said?
Well, we've seen that the domestic situation in Russia gets less attention internationally than perhaps it should, but they had to push through a massive tax hike because the fiscal situation in Russia is deteriorating pretty rapidly. There have been new sanctions leveraged by the United States as well on Lukoil and Rosneft just a couple of months ago. And, of course, the European Union also just put sanctions on shadow fleets, on indirect financing for Russia's energy section to pay for, oil and gas that's coming out indirectly through, primarily through India and China. And that means that they're starting to be starved of hard currency. And that means that the economic situation in the country, which has kind of recalibrated itself into a war economy, but that's not a sustainable model in the long term, could be coming to a head sometime next year.
I mean, one thing is that people were prognosticating the collapse of the Russian economy since the start of the war. And over the past few years, as you've alluded to, Russia has surprised a number of people in terms of its resilience. It has a good head of the central bank who has been walking a very tight rope. But you're saying this time it's different? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
This time it's different. And, again, it's not a sustainable model. It has short-term benefits. It is a classical Keynesian expansion of the economy. That's what a war economy is. But at some point you have to start to make sure you're getting hard currency. And that comes for Russia primarily through energy.
Got it. Okay, I would like to play a soundbite from Trump and also comments from European leaders before we get deeper into the various 28 or 19 or 24-point proposal and get comments from both Tyson and Nick on that. And also, Biresh, I don't know if you have any comments and questions from the chat, but let's roll on what Trump says he believes is necessary and is going to happen.
The way it's going, if you look, it's just moving in one direction. So eventually that's land that over the next couple of months might be gotten by Russia anyway. So do you want to fight and lose another 50, 60,000 people? Or do you want to do something now? This war could go on for years. And Russia's got a lot more people, got a lot more soldiers, So I think if Ukraine can make a deal, it's a good thing. I think it's great for both. Frankly, I think it's great for both.
So that is what the American president thinks. Here are what European leaders think.
The initial draft of the 28-point plan included points that were not acceptable, but also some very important elements that will be essential for a just and lasting peace.
There is finally a chance to make real progress toward a good peace. But the absolute condition for a good peace is a set of very robust security guarantees.
Ukraine's territory and sovereignty must be respected.
Ukraine's interests are also Europe's common interests, and we want to safeguard them together in the long term. This means that Ukraine must not be forced to make unilateral territorial concessions.
Unfortunately, the decision is in the hands of Putin, President Trump, of course, President Zelensky, not mainly in our European hands.
So very interesting. And Biresh?
There's a few questions that are rising in the chat. I'd like to bring them in. One is from Anile Chaturvedi, who is asking, who will give security guarantees to Ukraine, which they desperately demand? The US can give them, but doesn't want to, and the EU doesn't have political or societal willpower to provide those guarantees. And that was an observation to that question. One other question from Sarah Brown, who's asking, why would the Russians agree to freeze the line of contact? I don't know if you'd like to take any of them first.
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, anytime you're in any conflict situation and you're starting to try to negotiate a ceasefire, freezing lines makes the most sense. I mean, to have a unilateral withdrawal of Ukrainians from their own territory, to cede territory, in particular, defensive, areas in this belt of defense that they have, is really not fathomable. But as regards the will and the ability, yes, the United States is the one with the capability to provide credible security guarantees, and the Europeans have the will, but it's the two of them working together that's going to be necessary. There is another factor here that we need to talk about, and that's Russia itself. So this 28-point plan was, I guess, cautiously acceptable to the Russians. As it evolves in Geneva with the Ukrainians and the Europeans, it is becoming less acceptable to the Russians. And we're seeing that there's no real cross in the Venn diagram between the position that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have and the positions that the Russians have.
Now, on the security issue, I want to actually turn to Nick because Ukraine is asking for security guarantees. But what is really, how does President Zelensky go to his people and say, we have a deal, there are security guarantees, when Ukrainians, in their memory, they remember the 1994 Budapest Memorandum and how those security guarantees failed them. So I'm a little curious about what you're hearing, Nick, in terms of what is acceptable for Ukrainians, for them to feel like there are real guarantees that will hold.
I mean, that is the crucial question, right? That is something that even people who don't follow politics too closely are very conscious of here. That, you know, they signed away the kind of nuclear weapons that they inherited from the Soviet Union. They're obviously, you can say that maybe they wouldn't have had the resources to run them themselves and create an independent nuclear deterrent, but still they had those, the missiles, they had, you know, some of the planes, and they gave that away in return for the promise that their sovereignty would be respected. That is something that Russia signed to and, you know, accepted. Ukraine's borders didn't stop them coming in 2014, let alone now. I think people would really want to see peacekeepers of some form on the ground here. It doesn't necessarily have to be along the front lines. Lots of European countries are going to be a bit worried about, you know, seeing their soldiers somewhere near the front lines in Kharkiv region or you know, other places in the east. But even if they were, say, in the center of the country, in the west of the country, maybe closing the airspace, that would then free up Ukraine's own resources to, you know, basically put enough people along those front lines to, you know, basically act as a tripwire in case Russia tries to come in again. So I think that kind of visceral connection, being in harm's way, I think that was a term that Keir Starmer used earlier in the year when he was talking about British peacekeepers. He then had to kind of row back from that. But that, you know, willingness by the Europeans to put their own people in harm's way and to really, you know, invest money, not just kind of on the scale that we've seen basically, you know, with the NATO deployments in the Baltic countries where it's taken them years to, you know, place some troops there, some hardware. I think it's obviously going to be having a much bigger scale here in Ukraine if it happens. But I think that would really reassure people and give them the sense, okay, I can, if I've, you know, spent the last few years living with my children abroad in Europe somewhere, this is a sign that maybe it is worth trying to risk coming back in the hope that I can build a life there and not have to flee a couple of years down the road.
Nick, I want to follow up on that because one of the points of one of the proposals I was reading, it explicitly said that Ukraine would not pursue a nuclear program. They wanted to make sure of that, I believe. And so I'm a little curious, is there support in Ukraine for wanting nuclear weapons? I can imagine that that might be a conclusion a lot of people reach. I don't know what polling has shown in Ukraine about that.
Certainly, when you talk to, you know, everyday Ukrainians who are not connected to weapons or the nuclear program, they are, for the most part, very enthusiastic about the idea and will tell you that people, you know, foreign countries would be talking to Ukraine in a different way and that this war probably wouldn't have happened if Ukraine had had its independent nuclear deterrent. When you talk to people who are actually involved with, you know, the Soviet nuclear program, back in the day, we went to some of the bases of the Soviet nuclear deterrent that were actually, you know, on current, you know, Ukrainian territory. People there are a lot more skeptical about the logistics and just the finances, whether Ukraine could sustain that. But certainly, you know, there is a desire here to have a deterrent and to just to be too prickly, as it were, for Russia to want to try again. I think before nuclear weapons, the next step is, you know, more in the way of missiles, ballistic missiles. Ukraine is trying now to kind of regrow its missile program. It was formerly a center of the Soviet weapons program. The missiles building was in various Ukrainian cities, and there's a hope now that Ukraine will be able to build weapons that, you know, rather than waiting for tomahawks from Trump, they can have their own missiles and, you know, be credibly dangerous and threatening to the Russians so that the Russians don't try again.
Tyson, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the points. I don't know if there's any that you particularly want to talk about, but maybe this is a good time to ask you about this joint U.S.-Russia investment vehicle. It did sound like the kind of business deal that President Trump understands. Was this a surprise? It sounds a bit like a betrayal of Ukraine, frankly, in terms of taking money and then striking a deal with its enemy to profit from all of this.
So the initial plan had wanted to create some kind of investment vehicle using around $100 billion of the Russian sovereign assets that then the Europeans would contribute an additional 100 billion to, and that would then fund reconstruction, of which the profits would be 50% of the profits would be repatriated to the United States. Although that doesn't even make business sense on paper, you can hear how that rhymes with some initial ideas from the spring that ultimately led to this critical minerals fund that the U.S. and Ukraine established with the DFC and the Ukrainian government. The U.S.-Russia proposal it seems like it's not really, it's a non-starter, but there is a timetable issue here that I think that is kind of lurking in the background. The European Union is trying to make a decision on creating a new reparations loan, a mechanism basically to collateralize all of the Russian sovereign assets and provide them to Ukraine, or at least 140 billion of worth, which is the preponderant majority of what is in the European Union, housed in Belgium at a center called Euroclear, to use roughly 65-35 for weapons, financing, and then budget support. And that decision is supposed to come to a head in mid-December. So
2 weeks.
Basically, exactly. So kind of throwing this out there kicks dirt in that process because it says, here's an alternative. So I think that has a little bit to do with the timing as well.
Oh, sorry.
Do you think this will actually pass? Because we've been discussing this for quite some time. The Belgians really have a problem with this because they say that it sets a precedent and then it further downgrades the trust that other countries might have in Belgium, for example, as a repository of their cash. I mean, do you think this will really pass?
I think that there's no doubt that the Russians will try to retaliate. And what the Belgians are looking for is some kind of, distribution of liability across the EU 27. And those negotiations are lumbering and slow. So what the Europeans are currently discussing is what kind of bridging loan can we provide now as a stopgap measure until we finally conclude this. But I do think that this is going to happen.
Tyson, you were thinking about reconstruction for Ukraine under the Biden administration. What was the proposal that would have happened if this was a Democratic administration, Kamala Harris administration, that you get a sense? What is the difference that we're seeing in terms of this deal with the banks and reconstruction and the loans and the money?
Well, the first and foremost, I mean, we should note that the United States has been a supporter of, instrumentalizing Russian sovereign assets for Ukraine for a long time. We did it last year with the extraordinary revenue acceleration, the 50 billion in collateralized interest, which was then provided to Ukraine for their economy. And we've been pushing this in other formats. I think first and foremost, when my bosses used to, including President Biden, would talk about Ukraine's economic recovery, the first thing is they need the security. You cannot grow an economy. Foreign direct investment is not going to come in. People are not going to come home. People are not going to get back to work. You cannot build factories. You cannot ship without having security. So any kind of deal needs to provide that credible security guarantee, first and foremost air defense, in order for the economy to start to flourish.
Can I just ask a quick question? Sorry, I'd encourage people in the chat to sort of send us more questions related to the economic aspect of this, particularly the reconstruction. So while you all send us those questions, just a quick question about the minerals deal that was already signed. It's an important point you make there that if you don't have security in a country, why would people invest? What does that mean for the future of the minerals deal if there is no credible security guarantee and it's not coming from the United States as yet? Is that minerals deal then dead on arrival?
So it's a financing mechanism currently. So they're looking at, basically doing feasibility studies, doing geological surveys. This is going to be a lumbering process because in order to make those lithium mines, those titanium mines active, it's going to be a 10-year process. And there's a lot that you can do now. That's what we were trying to do in the Biden administration, was compress the time between the cessation. And we saw this at the end of World War II. World War II ended in 1945, but real reconstruction only started around 48, 49. And there was this long fallow period between the two. So what we were trying to do is say, how can we do all the paperwork, the legwork, the feasibility studies, the boring stuff, so that the second that hostility ends, you already have the turnkey ready, full-scale recovery in the back drawer.
Very interesting. Nick, I want to go to you soon, but I have one more question for Tyson, and then we're going to stick to the theme of of domestic politics influencing this geopolitical decision. Tyson, President Trump has been on what I would describe a losing streak in the past few weeks domestically. He's lost that congressional battle in terms of releasing information about Epstein. And I wonder to what extent, because Congress feels a little bit more emboldened, they're starting to think of him as a lame duck president. They're starting to think about their own re-elections in 1 year or two, or a few years down the line. How much do you think the walkback that we've seen from the United States, because there was the leak of the 28-point plan that seemed very kind of pro-Russian, and then D.C. White House walking it back a little bit, how much of that is because Trump's own party has enough Republicans of the classic kind, the Reagan-era type, who are pretty anti-Russian and did not like what they were seeing?
They have been very vocal in their opposition. We heard this at the Halifax Security Summit this past week. Even some like Mike Rounds, Senator Mike Rounds, who does have a future in the Senate, is not retiring, was critical of the plan. Obviously, Mitch McConnell, Don Bacon, others. I think that you're dealing with a pretty significant slice, at least 30% of the Republican caucus in Congress that is not supportive of this plan, at least as it's finished. And Lindsey Graham as well, who is a very strong ally of the president, was critical of this. Here's a question. To the extent that there are going to be credible security guarantees, what you would usually have is something that would need to go through Congress in the form of some kind of treaty. Otherwise, you're talking about a political agreement a la the Budapest Memorandum. So in order to have something that would pass through Congress, and it's unclear as to whether or not the president would seek congressional approval for something like this, but assuming that you're providing security guarantees to Ukraine, you're going to need Congress to basically ratify that. That means that you're going to need Congress on side for this kind of agreement. Otherwise, you're not getting something really worth value.
Just a quick point about the United States user Ravi Roshan making the point. It's a comment saying, am I the only one who thinks the closer you get to the US, the more likely you'll be in trouble? And there is a question from another user at Divorce One. This is to do with the internal politics of Ukraine. I don't know if you wanted to look at that right now.
That was exactly what I was going to Nick.
Because the question here from Divorce is Zelensky losing support from the Ukrainian people due to the corruption stuff? And that, of course, referring to the corruption scandal that engulfed the Ukrainian government just about a week back.
I mean, fantastic. I love it when the users do my job for me. That was exactly what I wanted to ask. So over to Nick to ask how that domestic issue is or could or is not impacting the negotiations with Russia and the United States.
Well, I think this is a huge kind of weight around Zelensky's shoulders, and it definitely makes his political future, any re-election, very, very difficult, if not impossible. I think people here in Ukraine are not going to forget in a hurry, because this wasn't just some kind of grey, abstract money-making scheme, as often happens. This was very visceral. The anti-corruption organizations here in Ukraine put out all those wiretaps, so you have conversations about people talking about their different nicknames, their kind of secret names they're giving each other that are all kind of ridiculous. Carlson, Professor Che Guevara, who's going to get a bag full of cash, where best to hand it over. These are things that are very memorable that people who are not interested in kind of detail will hold on to, and you definitely heard people on the street talking about it. I think there is certainly a kind of rally around the flag moment now, and people are not going to, even Zelensky's most vocal opponents are not going to call for him to go now in the middle of a war while he's representing their country. They realise the danger that Ukraine is in now, but this is not going to go away. And there's already kind of reporting, it seems like the people around Zelensky are going to try and retaliate against those anti-corruption bodies, maybe try and charge some of the investigators there with treason or something else. So there's definitely, it seems to be like a second act. We had the thing in the summer where Zelensky, the people around him, tried to take the independence of those anti-corruption bodies away. And you had people going out on the streets of Kyiv, international donors, the Europeans, telling him, no, we're not going to go along with this, stop. And we obviously now better understand perhaps why that was the case, why they were trying to kind of get these anti-corruption bodies to come to heel. I think there are more revelations still to come. We've been led to believe that there are more investigations running into military procurement. But I think for now, there is still a consensus here in Ukraine that it is worth keeping quiet a bit at least not contradicting Zelensky, not having parallel negotiations with the Trump team, for instance. There was reporting earlier in the year that the Trump team, people like J.D. Vance and his surroundings, had tried to reach out to other people in Ukrainian politics in the hope of basically finding a more convenient leader here in Ukraine. I think for now, Ukrainians are not going to play that game.
That's very interesting, and I can well imagine how frustrating, angry you would be if you're a Ukrainian who'd lost a son or daughter in this conflict, and then turn around to see that the political leaders have stolen millions and millions of dollars and money from the country. Tyson, I know that during the Biden administration, there was a lot of concern about Ukraine and corruption as well. I don't know if you have anything to weigh in on in terms of what you see moving forward for Zelensky and Ukrainian leadership.
It's a breathtaking own goal of the Zelensky administration. I mean, first, the attempt to roll back these independent anti-corruption agencies, and then what has happened just recently with these scandals. It's astounding. It's not only infuriating for the Ukrainians, but it's infuriating for the donor community. In the Biden administration, we worked very hard to make sure that there was accountability checks with Deloitte and others to make sure that every dime that was spent in Ukraine was spent in a clean and transparent way that did not fuel Ukraine's traditional corruption. The reason is because we had Congress breathing down our neck. The second that the whiff of corruption comes around, people will cut bait. It happened in 2015, 2016 during the first phase of this war, and it could easily happen again. And it is shocking that this administration in Ukraine has not learned those lessons. I have to say that anti-corruption, transparency, and rule of law were the North Star of the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine. They said, if you're fighting, your people are dying for a vision of this country that's more European, and that means leaving this kleptocracy, this tradition, this, rent-seeking kind of post-Soviet tradition that Putin embodies in the past. And to see this come roaring back, and it has come roaring back this year, frankly, partially because the United States has not been there to have that watchful eye, and also because the Europeans have not been as assiduous as they should be. But of course, this is going to hurt Ukraine's reputation, the Zelensky administration's reputation in Europe with other donors, and in the accession process, which is what the Ukrainians have been fighting for. It is European flags that were flying on the Maidan in 2013 and 2014. This vision of that road to Europe has been animating this country for over 10 years. And this kind of thing is exactly the kind of blow domestically that the country can afford.
It's a raw nerve that this part of the discussion has kicked off in the community chat, because people are talking about it and commenting on it. So the user Death Before Dishonor 2300 saying Zelensky is making millions while Ukrainians are being murdered. And there is also a user DSLFT asking what guarantees does Europe have to ensure that the money does not go to corrupt Ukrainian politicians? And I wonder if there is a mechanism to prevent that.
Yeah, Nick, can you also clarify whether the corruption scandal directly is connected to Zelensky and whether he has profited? My understanding is it's people around him, but please do let us know.
Yeah. So for now, no direct proof linking him in terms of him profiting from this. This is basically the kind of person organising all the kind of flows of corrupt money, was a former business partner of his from his days in show business, and then it was mainly in the energy ministry, connected to the kind of government company that manages nuclear power. We do expect more revelations, and there have been mutterings here in Kyiv that also this would affect the head of his kind of presidential administration, Andriy Yermak, who Zelensky has refused to fire, even though he was under a lot of pressure to do so. And Yermak was basically representing Ukraine in Geneva, and is kind of the face of the Ukrainian negotiating team, so that obviously protects him in a way. But I want to come back to something that Tyson just said, which is really important about the EU in all this. When you speak to anti-corruption activists and kind of people who study all this here, they are very critical of the Europeans' inability to play power politics. Ukraine is currently dependent on European money. The Europeans are the big game in town, and they have a lot more leverage, but they are very bad at using it. And not only that, at the time of those protests in the summer, when the government tried to basically kill off those anti-corruption organizations by taking their independence, there were briefings by European officials, and they seemed incredibly relaxed. They were not taking it as seriously as ordinary Ukrainians were, as officials from other countries. And there is a sense that they are too soft on Zelensky, that they have basically bought into Zelensky as being this kind of, basically beyond criticism, the kind of heroic wartime leader, and that they are not willing to, use the whip, that it's only just, the carrot for him, and that they are basically going to close, their eyes to the new revelations. So there's a real kind of, anger here in Ukraine amongst the kind of anti-corruption community that Europe has all these tools but just isn't using them.
Melissa, if I can just bring in a slightly tangential point here. This is because it keeps coming up in the community chat, and I think it's just worth addressing it. It goes back to the aspect of reconstruction and who pays for what. A user has been asking repeatedly about, we've been discussing reconstruction in Ukraine. The question is coming up about reconstruction in Russia. I'm going to take the question, bring it to our guests, but there's a few points that need to be made. This is from the user Raja DM, who has been asking in various forms, but this is the question that we're going to be taking. Who will pay for the reconstruction of damages to infrastructure in Donbass and Russian provinces of Belgorod and Kursk? I'm going to give that to Tyson, but before Tyson just answers that, it is just worth remembering the context within which this question is being asked. We're talking about a country, Russia, whose leader has an arrest warrant out against him for a war that was started against a sovereign nation. The European Union has recognized that Putin and his army committed an act of aggression. And there have been several resolutions at the United Nations where the majority of countries, especially in the UN General Assembly, have voted against Russia when it comes to aspects of this war. I just wanted to bring that context in. Tyson, over to you for an answer.
Yeah, I mean, so the Donbass is a particular case because, of course, it is part of Ukraine. It depends on, its status. If it is still Russian occupied, then I would assume that the Russians would be the ones to attempt to rebuild it.
I'm fine now.
But as regards, Russia in general, that's not something that's in discussion because, as you rightly mentioned, Russia is the clear aggressor in this case in confluence of international law. And international law is clearly on the side of Ukraine in terms of where the duty of, reparations is held. That's with the Russians. That's going to be a part of any kind of peace package, I would assume. And, to the extent that there has been damage, obviously it's minimal compared to what has happened on Ukrainian territory. The damage has been massively civilian targeted. There has been attacks in Russian territory, particularly military targets and oil refineries. And I should have brought this up earlier. The attacks that the Ukrainians have made on oil refineries in Russia have been extremely effective in knocking out a lot of its capacity to produce energy. So that is another way that there's new bottlenecks for Russia to be able to export oil and gas to the world. But I don't think that this is a topic of conversation.
Well, thanks for clearing that up, Tyson. I think it was just important to have that there. I hope you have your responses there.
Absolutely. Nick, I want to turn to you and ask, I want to make sure that we've sort of run through the points, but not one by one. Are there any of the points that have been shared of the 28-point proposal or the 24-point proposal, the 19-point proposal, which I think, I keep saying these numbers, but and Tyson keeps laughing a little bit because we have the Ukrainian counter-proposals, the Europeans providing sort of like
So just take an average,
Yeah.
1928, I don't know where we are right now.
Absolutely.
12.5, I don't know.
2 dozen points.
Yeah, absolutely. But Nick, is there any point there that you'd like to talk a little bit more about that we haven't touched on that is of great concern to people in Ukraine that's been covered in media there?
Well, I think one thing that is a big deal here in Ukraine, in one of these iterations, I kind of feel a bit shy about calling it a plan. It feels like just, a shopping list that has, done the rounds and kind of, got longer and shorter as the days pass. But one of the versions had the demand for having Russian as a national kind of official language here in Ukraine. That has long been part of the kind of Kremlin narrative that somehow Russian speakers are being persecuted here in Ukraine, despite the fact that, President Zelensky is a Russian speaker at home and didn't speak particularly good Ukrainian before he entered politics. And yet he was voted in by a large majority of Ukrainians. That is kind of part of the kind of culture wars. Russia realizes it's losing Ukraine, especially younger Ukrainians, as they firstly, get more Ukrainian language content, have Ukrainian language schooling, more younger people speak English and kind of consume world culture through English rather than through the Russian translation that was the case maybe 20 years ago. So that is something that the Russians have been trying to push so consistently. And then there's also the question of the Russian Orthodox Church, of the Moscow Patriarchy, which obviously is a red cloth to many Ukrainians because we've seen, top officials, top clerics in that church basically standing next to Putin and, justifying this war and kind of explaining why it is necessary, telling Russians why they should fight. So having that church re-establish its parishes here in Ukraine, that is something that people see basically as a kind of fifth column, as a kind of danger for Ukraine's kind of cultural sovereignty. And then there was also, other questions about reparations, right? Some of these drafts had a provision for basically Ukraine having to give up all reparations claims, also given a kind of free ride to anyone who's accused of war crimes here, basically kind of just all the kind of war crimes cases that have been collected in kind of meticulous work over the last few years to kind of give all that up. I think that is all very, very damaging and also very kind of offensive to people who've lived through Bucha and other Russian kind of atrocities here in Ukraine. And I think it was just meant to basically underline the fact that this, from a Russian perspective, is meant to be about a capitulation. This is not meant to be about a compromise or a deal that somehow allows both sides to get out of this war. This is about imposing basically what Vladimir Putin wanted in February of 2022 and making the Ukrainians pick up the pieces and potentially hoping for Ukraine to then kind of fall to pieces in recriminations over this deal.
I mean, Nick, you mentioned the culture wars, and I don't think my understanding is that even people who spoke better Russian in Ukraine have really opted to speak only Ukrainian and get better at speaking that language. And as you said, younger people speaking Ukrainian, and there has been a flourishing in some ways, even despite this conflict, of Ukrainian novels and plays and music. So it seems like it is a big point of contention. I think we tend to focus on the politics, but could you talk a little bit about this Ukrainian identity and the efforts that have been made by people in the creative community, the soft power, so to speak, to sort of build that up in the past 3 years?
Well, certainly, it used to be quite difficult if you were learning Ukrainian as a foreigner like me here in Kyiv to learn Ukrainian here, because even people who spoke Ukrainian, if they realized that you could speak Russian or English, they would then, out of kind of politeness and friendliness, kind of, change to Russian or English to make it easier for you, and they wouldn't necessarily have the patience to kind of hear a foreigner speaking bad Ukrainian. That has changed. People are happy to see foreigners making the effort, let alone other Ukrainians. I think there is kind of an etiquette now in the country where, for the most part, people will speak Ukrainian to those that they don't know, to strangers in kind of service contexts, and no one is going to give them a hard time for speaking Russian with their friends at home, at the table with their colleagues if they want to. But that Ukrainian is the language of the outside world with new people. And I think the thing that's important to remember here is that, like Catalan in Spain under the dictatorship of Franco, Ukrainian was a language that was for a long time banned or marginalized by first Russian imperial authorities and then by the Soviet authorities. There were little phases where the Soviet authorities kind of gave Ukrainian a bit of a kind of demonstrative kind of chance, but then it often was then revised after a couple of years, and there was a real worry about that Ukrainian language means Ukrainian nationalism, and that's why Russian was kind of pushed as the kind of language for anyone who wanted to get ahead, wanted to get a career, and that is what they are reacting to against now. That is why there's been that push for Ukrainian language schools, and most Ukrainians will pick up Russian anyway by YouTube, by films. That is not a problem of understanding Russian. It is about having Ukrainian, a smaller language that has been exposed to a lot of pressure and bans and kind of attempts to make it go away. Give that a space and allow it to kind of turn into the language of Ukraine's independent identity.
Thank you for that. We've just got a few more minutes, and I want to actually look a little bit ahead. So questions to both of you on that. Tyson, I'm wondering, and I know it's very difficult to say without knowing what will pass in terms of these negotiations and whether something will be agreed upon in the coming weeks. But how is all of this informing the foreign policies and the military preparations for Eastern European nations, particularly Poland and the Baltics?
So I think that there were some very unsettling components of the initial 28-point plan for the Poles in particular, because it basically said that the Europeans needed to forward deploy their, air defense assets into Poland and implied, a gradual withdrawal of the United States. We've already seen some operational withdrawal of the United States from areas like Romania. And there's an expectation that in the coming months, the United States will release a new national defense strategy, national security strategy, which some believe, given the fact that the people shaping those strategies are close to Vance, close to some of these wings, would have a greater focus on spheres of influence, perhaps the Western Hemisphere, much more, let's say, less Eurocentric, maybe with some emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, but obviously more unilateralist and transactional, that there are these elements there that says Europe needs to take responsibility. To the extent that the United States is going to be involved, it's going to be more of a protection or a service provider relationship where the Europeans need to pay for defense. And that is, of course, very unsettling for Poland and the Baltic states. So I think that they're starting to think, how can we provide independent deterrence? We saw, in the past couple of months, these kind of slightly below the threshold hybrid incursions, attacks, Russians playing footsie with, Polish airspace, for example, the drone swarms around airports that Russia has plausible deniability on. And, the response in Poland and elsewhere has not yet met the level that we've seen, for example, when Russia incurred it in Turkish airspace in 2015, where the Turks basically said, also a NATO ally, said, if you come into our airspace, we're going without authorization, you're going to be shot down. And then they did that. So, there is still some trepidation to escalate, but there is definitely an awareness that they need to start to set boundaries.
Thank you so much. And going to Nick, I know it's very cold out there in Kyiv, so thank you so much for joining us for the almost a whole hour. Question to you is, how will this be informing Ukrainian policy moving forward? You touched upon this in terms of not being able to trust American security guarantees, and also a desire to be self-reliant in terms of building its own defense manufacturing, for example. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, that's not just a Ukraine position. That's something you hear also the Europeans say time and time again, that Ukraine's army is its own best security guarantee beyond anything that the Europeans can provide, or the Americans for that matter. So I think all this kind of talk in some of these drafts of reducing the size of the Ukrainian army, let alone, limiting what kinds of missiles, the range of missiles that Ukraine can build, is basically a red line, because this is not credibly about Russia being scared of Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to march into Russia. This is about Russia being scared of losing the ability to march into Ukraine whenever it wants, losing that ability as the kind of former colonial power in this part of the world to reset borders and to get rid of leaders that it doesn't like. So I think that is not something the Ukrainians are likely to budge on. Obviously, in terms of the size of the army, the limitation there is more what Ukraine can afford to maintain during peacetime. Can it afford to keep 800,000 people in uniform outside of a war situation where it's getting money from the West? That's questionable. But I think it's going to be very difficult to convince Ukrainians to kind of make some kind of pledge to the Russians to do that. In terms of the kind of technology, obviously, Ukraine has a lot of experience that is missing in other parts of the West right now, in terms of drone technology, in terms of finding kind of agile, cheap solutions rather than waiting months and years for the kind of dinosaurs of Western arms production to come up with something very expensive and tailor-made that is then delivered in very small quantities over years and years. So they have an advantage there. But I think the question is, it all comes back to the security guarantees and what state Ukraine is going to be in. Is this going to be a country with some kind of security and a country that's convinced that the West is going to help at least with money, if not with weapons, and that can then go about rebuilding and creating an army that can be sustained for years? Or is it going to be basically a place waiting for another Russian attack, and some of the people, when the borders are open, will they just all follow their families to Europe and say, I'm not going to do this again? That could happen. So it is all open, but I think certainly Ukraine is a lot more visible in the West right now. People in the West have seen what Ukraine can do. It's not just a post-Soviet state somewhere between Russia and the EU. I think that is something that is a huge benefit for Ukraine in terms of interest and willingness to engage with this country. But without some kind of security guarantees, all of that could be lost.
Nick Connolly, thank you so much for joining us.
And Nick, just a quick word of appreciation for one of our longer-term viewers, Devos, who feels bad for you for standing out there in the cold, but still not freezing and providing us the content that you do. Thanks so much again.
I mean, I wanted to show you. I mean, Donald Trump likes to. Well, he likes to talk about the fact that the Golden Domes here in Kyiv have been destroyed during the war. I just wanted you to kind of, see that despite the power outages, we have enough power here in Kyiv to illuminate the St. Sophia Cathedral behind me, and they're still in place for now. So that's, an optimistic note to end on.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Thank you so much. Tyson, there's so much we can talk more about. If it's okay to go over a few minutes, Nick was talking about this one point in the proposal about the size of the Ukrainian peacetime army, and it was 800,000, then it was 600,000.
Right.
And even with that, and I'm not a specialist, but even reading that clause, the first thing that goes in my mind is, well, how do you define who's a military personnel and who isn't? So there's all these weird details where certainly I can see a situation where you do some funny accounting, right? What is the person who is sitting down in front of a computer making decisions about a drone attack? Are they in the military or are they not? And all these little details that need to be worked out that was just sort of plastered, as Nick said, as a shopping list, and that you've been very careful about saying it's not really a real proposal, a list of proposals.
I mean, it's obviously, it's a top-line thing, and the devil's in the details, and the document is very sparse in terms of details, and it would need to be worked out. But, the bottom line is, even working from top lines, you need to start to come up with a framework that Ukraine can feel comfortable with, that it can create credible deterrence. And they don't feel comfortable with the $500,000 or 500,000 soldier mark, and they didn't feel comfortable with the 600,000 soldier mark, and so that has been a red line for them. But the truth is that even right now, they are having some personnel shortages, and there has been a pretty lively debate in Ukraine as whether or not they should lower the age of conscription to around 23 from 25, where it's at now. And, that is a politically difficult decision that the government hasn't been ready to make yet. They say that they have sufficient personnel. But again, this is about constraints. So, there needs to be a broad enough aperture for them to have credible deterrence, and that's where they're going to draw the line.
Well, I think we're getting near the end. Tyson, if you have any final thoughts, if not, we're going to go to the poll results and see what you think about what our viewers have decided to say.
I'd love to hear the poll results.
Yeah, well, let me just repeat our poll question first. We were asking, where are the latest Ukraine talks headed? We've got 170 votes in the end. 38% voted Russian hostility against Europe. 30% said frozen battle lines. 17% said to a durable peace, and 15% says Trump winning Nobel Prize. What do you think about that, Tyson?
Well, I think that Europe is already in war with Russia. It's just a question of degree. Obviously, the hot conventional war is in Ukraine, and then it kind of goes down by degree across Europe. But these incursions, the to airspace, the hybrid war, the disinformation, the drones, this is already present, and they're testing lines and seeing what they can get away with. So I think the top answer is already the case.
And there's another line that a lot of people don't think of, which is the digital space, right? The digital warfare that is ongoing. All right, but that would be another program, the digital war. Tyson Barker, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tyson.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us and for your chat questions and comments. As a reminder, we'll always post next week's topic on the YouTube community page about
24 hours in advance. That's the general idea. So Tuesday next week, you all should know what we're discussing. And maybe it's Ukraine, maybe it's not. Who knows? Steve Witkoff is supposed to be in Moscow next week. So we'll see what we end up discussing on Wednesday next week. But thanks so much for joining us today. Cherie, thanks for moderating the chat and bringing us some of those comments and those questions in. Thanks to all of you guys who participated. We like listening to your comments, bringing them into your discussion. See you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.